Hi there everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Uncast Show. So I want to wish you a good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you're watching this from in the world. Now, today's video is the official Uncast video about Unraid 7. So this video is going to be absolutely great. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking not only about all of the new features, we're going to be talking about things such as Unraid subpools, or auxiliary vdevs. We're going to be talking about the fact that we don't need an Unraid Array anymore. And we're going to be looking at how we can actually remove it and setting up a server from scratch without an array as well. And as we'll be setting up a server from scratch, of course, we're going to be talking about Zpools. Now, have you ever wondered what's the difference when you've got 4 drives? If you put that into a RAID Z2, so you have 2 drives of redundancy, or you chose to have 2 sets of 2 mirrored drives. Well, you're going to have the same amount of redundancy, but is there any difference? Well, we'll be talking about that later. Now, as you all probably know, there's loads of new cool Docker features, and we've talked about them before in previous Uncast videos, but we'll be looking at that as well. But there's also loads of actually awesome VM features as well. And we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive into VMs. We're going to be looking at all of the new features that the VM manager offers, and we're also going to be looking at snapshots and how we actually restore them. Now, there's going to be this and much, much more in this video. Now, the first thing we're going to be talking about in this video is ReiserFS, or in Unraid 7, you could say the lack of ReiserFS as it's being phased out. So we're going to start with that. Now, it's a pretty long video, guys, so grab yourself a coffee, a beer, sit back and relax, and I'm going to go over to my desk and let's make a start. Okay, so Unraid 6.12 is the last version of Unraid that allows us to actually format disks in ReiserFS. And even if we choose ReiserFS in 6.12, we do get a warning that ReiserFS is depreciated and we should use another file system. And the file system to use in the array, in my opinion, is XFS. Now, I don't want to actually format this drive, so I'm just going to remove it and start back up the array. So let's upgrade this server here to Unraid 7. And what I like to do before any upgrades is I go to the plugins page and check for updates and make sure all of my plugins are up to date before I do any upgrades. And as well as upgrading the plugins, I think it's a good idea to also do a check for any Docker container updates that we might have as well. And the final thing I like to do is with the Fix Common Problems plugin installed, is to just check my server for any errors before I do any upgrades. Okay, so we can see there's a few errors and warnings here. Now the ReiserFS warning on my disk 2. Fix Common Problems recommends that I migrate this to XFS, and we'll do that in a moment after we've upgraded to Unraid 7. Now, there's a new patch here, the Unraid patch plugin, which I don't have installed on this server. So let's install that now. Basically, this plugin just keeps the Unraid server up to date with all the latest patches for the version of the OS that you're running. Okay, so other warnings that I've got here. There are 2 plugins that are not compatible with the system. The Dynamics Cache Directories plugin and the Wake in LAN plugin is no longer supported. So I'm going to go across and remove those. So let's remove these. And now with our last check on Fix Common Problems. Okay, so Fix Common Problems, all but the ReiserFS error, has got a clean bill of health. So before I go and update, let's just have a look at the kernel that Unraid 6.12 is currently using. So it's using Linux kernel 6.1.126. And also, whilst we're here, let's have a look at the Docker version that 6.12 is using. And the Docker version is 24.0.9. And finally, let's go to the VM manager and have a look at the libvirt version, which is 8.7.0. And QEMU 6.12 is running 7.2.0. Okay, anyway, it's ready for us to upgrade now. So to do that, we need to go to Tools here. And under About here, we can see the Upgrade OS button. So I'm going to click onto that. And here I can see there's one stable version of Unraid, which is Unraid 7.0.0, which was released on the 9th of January this year. So I'm going to click on to view changelog here, and here we can view the changelog of everything that's new in Unraid 7. But we're not going to read that because that's what this video is all about. So I'm going to click on here to continue the update on Serenity, which is the name of this server. And so the update's now being downloaded. Okay, so everything's downloaded, so I'm going to click on to Done. Okay, so at the top here we can see the last thing we need to do is to reboot the server. So I'm going to click on here to reboot. And rebooting the server will bring us straight into Unraid 7. Okay, so let's log in. And here we can see we're straight into Unraid 7. Now, like I was saying earlier, when we were looking at Unraid 6.12, if I was to add this disk now, we can see here that the option to actually format in ReiserFS has been removed from Unraid totally. Now, the reason being is ReiserFS has actually been deleted from the kernel as of Linux kernel 6.13. And for those of you who don't really know about ReiserFS, it's actually got quite a checkered history. The person who actually made ReiserFS, he actually ended up murdering his wife, and it has quite a whole dark history to it, to be honest. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about, but let's go back to the Unraid server here. And what I'm going to do is I don't want to add any more drives to this server, so I'm just going to start up the array. Okay, so here we are in Unraid 7. So we can see, although we can't actually format a disk in ReiserFS, well, we can still actually use disks that we already have in the server that may already be ReiserFS. And that's because we're not actually on the kernel that's actually dropped support as yet. This version of Unraid, Unraid 7.0.0, is using Linux kernel 6.6.68. Now, a great thing about this kernel for everyone out there who's using Intel Arc GPUs, well, this kernel gives full support for those. So that's really cool. Even though this kernel version here does support ReiserFS, it's a good idea, in my opinion, to make preparations for when we do actually go on to Linux kernel 6.13. Because when we do that, well, the ReiserFS disks are not going to work in the array anymore. So it's a good idea to actually be able to reformat these as XFS. And it's actually really easy now to be able to clear one of these drives using Mover. Now, we can't actually use Mover from the GUI to do this, but it really is super easy to do. Now, if I go here and we look at some of the notes about this release here, we can see we can use Mover to empty an array disk. We use this command here, mover space start space -e disk, and then the number of the disk, and then we pipe that into logger, and at the end of the command here we can see an AND symbol, which means this runs in the background. So what I need to do, because I'm using disk 2 here that's ReiserFS, what I want to do is clear off everything here and have this moved onto another disk somewhere in my array. Obviously, for me, that's going to be disk 1 because there's only 2 drives in this array. But if you had multiple disks of, say, kind of 10, it will just find somewhere to keep the data and clear off that disk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a terminal window, and I'm going to type mover space start space -e space and disk 2. That's the disk that I want to clear. Space and then pipe, if I can find that on my keyboard here. And logger, and then a space and an AND. Now this AND at the end is pretty important because what that does is it just runs this in the background. So by having that on the end, it means we can close this window and the command will still be running. So let's hit enter, and we can see here we've got a response. So I can close this now, and if we scroll down, we can see here that Move is now running. So we just need to wait for Mover to finish. And what it will do is it will move the files and folders off my disk 2. And because I've only got 2 drives in this array, it's going to put it onto disk 1. But if you had more drives, it may well actually scatter it across multiple drives, especially if you didn't have enough space on the actual first drive. And we can see here the reads and writes, the activity on this drive, so we can see things are moving. So we just need to wait for this to finish, and then we can move to the next stage. Okay, so it looks like here the disk activity is finished, so let's scroll down and see if move is still running. No, move is finished now, so if I scroll up here and I look on this disk, we can see now this disk is empty, and the contents have been put onto my disk 1 here. So what I need to do now this disk is empty, is I can stop the array and reformat this in ZFS. So let's stop the array. And now all we need to do is to actually select this disk here and change the file system from ReiserFS to one of these other file systems here. Now, if we wanted to as well, we could actually encrypt this drive, and we could use the same system to be able to encrypt any drive that we want on the array. So we could just clear that drive, and then we could reformat it encrypted if we wanted to go through and encrypt some disks. So why not encrypt this one? I'm going to click on to apply here and done. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here and click on to start. Now here we can see that it says unmountable and it's the wrong file system. This is perfectly normal because this hasn't been formatted as yet. So I'm going to scroll back down to the bottom here and I'm going to check this box here and I'm going to click on to format. Now you may be wondering, if I'm formatting this drive encrypted, why it's not asking for a passphrase. Well, there are these other drives that I have in the server that are already encrypted, and so Unraid's going to use the same password for those. But if I didn't have any encrypted drives at all in the server, it would in fact ask for a passphrase before formatting. And now we can see that the former ReiserFS disk is now all formatted correctly in ZFS. And also, it hasn't affected parity at all. Just because we've reformatted the drive, it doesn't actually break parity. So the array is going to be working absolutely fine. Now, I'm sure that most of us out there, we don't have ReiserFS drives in our server, but I just wanted to go over that first before moving on to what I call the more exciting things about Unraid 7. Now, as I said earlier, I'd really recommend doing this sooner rather than later. Yes, on Unraid 7 currently, we can still read ReiserFS disks. And that's because Unraid 7, like I was saying earlier, is on kernel 6.6.68. But what I want to do is show you what happens when we actually go to a kernel above this. So let me show you that now. Now, what will happen when we update to a newer kernel? And on this Unraid, I've updated here to Linux kernel 6.14 RC2. Which is the newest kernel as of making this video. Now, this isn't actually officially supported by Unraid, so I don't suggest you upgrade your kernel. But I just wanted to show you here, when it is upgraded to this kernel, well, any kernel above 6.13, well, ReiserFS is not going to work. And we can see here, it says that it's unmountable and there's no file system. So that's why it's a good idea to now, whilst it's still easy and you're not going to have to downgrade to earlier versions of Unraid, to come off your ReiserFS disks, I really suggest doing it now if you've got any in your system. Okay, so in my opinion, one of the biggest things in Unraid 7 is the fact that we don't actually need to have an Unraid array anymore. If we go across to my server here, Battlestar, we can see an example of this. Now, this server has only 2 Zpools, both of which are SSDs. This top one here has a usable space of about 10 terabytes and it consists of 2 terabyte SATA SSDs. Now this faster pool beneath here, this is made up of 3 4 terabyte NVMe drives. And as you can see here, there is no Unraid array. Oh, and there's a third pool here I forgot about, which I call ZRust, basically because this drive here is a 12 terabyte regular hard drive, hence I call this one ZRust, as in ZFS Rust Pool. Okay, so one thing I want to mention about NVMEs and SSDs in general is it's highly recommended not to actually use them in a regular Unraid array. And the reason for that is because inside of the Unraid array, trim or discard as it's called is not actually supported on SSDs. So if we use SSDs in our server, we should always use them in a pool. Now, before we actually go ahead and look at how we can have our Unraid server without an array, I just want to say that I really do love the Unraid Array. If we go to my main server here, BaseStar, we can see here that I still have an Unraid Array. I think the Unraid Array is absolutely excellent. I think the Unraid Array is unbeatable for media duties, for storing your media for things like Plex, Jellyfin, or MB. You can't actually beat the Unraid Array because whenever you need more space, you can just add another drive really easily without any problem at all. And my favorite file system for the Unraid Array, as I said earlier, is XFS. But you'll notice that I do actually have a ZFS drive in my Unraid Array. And the reason I have one drive as ZFS is because I like to actually have some of the other Zpools in this server be able to replicate ZFS data into the array onto this particular drive. But we're not going to talk about ZFS replication today. We can have a look at that in another video sometime in the future. Now, let's go back to the server that we were on at the beginning of this video. Now we can see here, we've just got this small array of 3 drives, 1 parity and 2 data. So if we wanted to actually get rid of this array, now maybe I decide that I don't want to actually have an Unraid Array anymore. I still want to use these drives, but I want to use them in a pool. Now, obviously, one thing to note, if you ever change your Unraid Array and you want to make it as a pool, you're going to have to move the data from your Unraid Array to somewhere else. And we can't actually do it in the same way as what we did a moment ago using Mover. We'd have to actually manually move all of the data somewhere else first if we wanted to convert our Unraid Array into a pool. Okay, so I don't have any data on this array that I actually care about. So I'm going to stop the array here. And what we need to do is unassign all of these drives. And then with all of the drives unassigned, we go to slots here and we set the slots to none. So here we can see now there's currently no Unraid Array. Okay, so now with these drives removed from the array, I can now set them if I want to be in their own pool. Now if I scroll down here, we can see here I've got 5 drives that I can choose from. There are 4 4TB drives here, which are spinning Rust drives. They're regular hard drives. And also, I've got a 1TB SSD. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a new pool. So I'm going to click on Add Pool here, and I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it Rusty. And for slots, because I've got 4 4TB drives, I think I'm going to choose 4. And I'm going to click on to Add. Okay, so now we can see here that another pool is being created. So now I just need to select the disks of which I want to have this pool made from. So here I've selected all of my 4TB drives. Now one thing I like to do before I actually start is I come along and I click onto the pool here. And before I do anything, I always click Erase Pool. And to do that, I just need to confirm the name of the pool. So I'm going to type in Rusty. And now that's erased the pool, getting rid of any data that I might have had on those drives. For pools made up of multiple disks, we've got the choice of either ZFS or ButterFS. Now, if we were only to have one drive in the pool, we would also have the choice of XFS. But for multiple drives, it's either ZFS, ButterFS, or the encrypted Lux versions of those file systems. Now, in my opinion, ZFS wins hands down. Although there are use cases for ButterFS, I do prefer ZFS. If we're using a RAID 5 or equivalent, well, ButterFS isn't the best for that. RAID 5 in ButterFS, in fact, is still not officially marked as stable. So I'm going to use ZFS here. And now I get the choice of how I want to use these disks in my Zpool. So what I've got here, I've got the choice of Stripe, Mirror, RAID Z1, RAID Z2, and RAID Z3. So a stripe, what's that? Well, if I was to use a stripe, this would put all of my 4 disks together and stripe all the data across it, but there would be no redundancy at all. This would give me the best speed, but it would be quite a risky thing to do. So the next thing here is a mirror. So with a mirror, that's exactly what it sounds like. It mirrors the data on different drives. So here I can have 2 vdevs of 2 devices. So that's basically 2 groups of 2 drives. that would be mirrored, or I can have one VDEV of 4 drives, so that would just give me 4 copies of the data, each drive being a copy of the other. Now, obviously, when you're using mirrors, we are losing a significant amount of space. So, in my opinion, using RAID Z is a good compromise between the both. So, what are RAID Z levels? Now, if you're familiar with regular RAID levels, RAID 5 is basically what RAID Z1 is. Now, the properties of RAID Z1 mean we stripe the data across all 4 drives, but we lose the space of one drive in the parity calculations that are actually written to these drives. Unlike what we're used to in a regular Unraid array, where one drive holds all of the parity, in RAID Z1, the parity information is striped across all of the 4 drives. In fact, this is one reason why Unraid arrays are really easy to actually add disks to, because the parity is kept separately. And in fact, if we look at my Unraid array here, you can see here that I've got one drive of parity making up my pool. And so basically, a one-disk parity array is very similar to RAID Z1, because we lose one disk in size of available space in the actual pool or the array due to parity. Using RAID Z1, I would have 3 of the 4 terabyte drives available for data, so I'd have a usable space of 12 terabyte. Now, if I wanted to be a bit more cautious, I could choose RAID Z2, and this would give me 2 drives out of the 4 that would be used for parity. But because I've only got 4 drives that make up the pool, I would be losing 50% of usable space. So RAID Z2 would allow me to lose any 2 drives in my pool and still not lose any data. But because I've only got 4 drives in this pool, I would be losing 2 drives worth of space. So it would give me a very similar protection and usable space than if I chose a mirror and had 2 VDEVs, now a VDEV being a group of drives that were mirrored. So again, I would lose 50% of the space, but I could lose 2 drives and still actually be okay. Now, I want to actually talk about, when we come to choices like this, of what actually is the difference. So if I'm going to lose, say, 50% of the space of these drives, what would be the advantage of having a mirror of 2 groups of 2 devices, or choosing RAID Z2 and having one VDEV of 4 devices? Well, if I chose the mirror here, in my opinion, this is actually going to give me slightly better performance having 2 mirrored VDEVs than if I used RAID Z2. But with RAID Z2, I can lose any 2 of these drives and not lose data. But with a mirror, with 2 groups of 2 devices, let's say we got Group A and Group B, if I lost one drive from Group A and one drive from Group B, everything's cool. I'm not going to lose any data. But if the 2 drives that failed were both from Group A, well, I'm going to lose the whole pool and I'll lose all of my data. So, if I want to actually be super safe, I would use RAID Z2, so any 2 drives can actually fail, and it doesn't matter which 2 that do fail, because I've only got one group of 4 devices. But if I wanted to go for a little bit more performance, I would probably use the mirror and the 2 groups of 2 devices. Okay, so let's move on and think about RAID Z3. Now, again, this just wouldn't be used really. If you've only got 4 drives in your pool, it's really pointless. But what this allows us to do is have any 3 drives fail and we don't lose any data. Now, if I had, say, 12 drives in this pool, RAID Z3 might be a good fit. But for my little 4x4 terabyte pool I've got here, RAID Z1 is going to give me the best bang for buck. I can lose any 1 drive in the pool. My performance is going to be pretty good. So that's what I'm going to choose. Now you can see here that I've got compression turned on. Now, a lot of people worry about turning on compression. They think if they turn compression on, well, it's got to actually slow down the server. Well, in fact, in 99% of cases, it's the reverse of that. It's quicker to actually read compressed data and less of it off the drives than it is to read more data that's uncompressed and read that off the drives. Modern CPUs are so fast that it doesn't really touch the sides when decompressing compressed data, So the read and write speeds are just faster from having the compression, and plus we get to fit more data on our drives. So in my opinion, it's a win-win. Okay, so that's how I'm setting up my pool. So with that done, I'm going to click on to apply. And then done. Okay, so now we can see here are my 4 drives in the pool. Okay, so now let's take a look at here where it says add subpool. Now these are basically auxiliary vdevs, which Unraid calls subpools. And that's because they're additional devices that can be added to the Zpool to provide specific performance or functionality benefits. So unlike the main pool, these subpools serve specialized purposes that can help improve performance, but only in certain workloads. However, there's one critical thing that we need to remember. If some of these auxiliary vdevs fail, we can end up losing all of the data on a pool. So that's really something important to keep in mind. And what I like to say is if you're not sure whether you need a subpool, well, you probably actually don't. But anyway, let's go through each type, what they do, and whether, in fact, they might be useful for you. Now, I think for most Unraid home labbers, the only 2 of these really that are worth considering is the slog and the L2 arc. The others, like special metadata and deduplication, in my opinion, they're often more trouble than what they're worth. So first up, we've got the slog, or what that stands for is separate log device. This is for what are called synchronous writes. Now, most everyday writes are actually not synchronous at all, they're actually asynchronous and don't use this. But some applications, such as certain databases or NFS shares, these do actually require sync writes to guarantee the data integrity. So what does this slog actually do? What it does is it gives a fast location for these writes to be committed to before they're written to the main pool. So it basically makes the synchronous writes faster because it's going to like a fast SSD first, and so it can improve reliability and consistency for these type of workloads. Now, what a slog doesn't do, it won't make your gaming VM run faster, it won't speed up your file transfers unless they do rely on synchronous writes. I like to think of a slog a bit like a car spoiler. It looks fancy on kind of like supercars and things like that. And yes, it does provide aerodynamic benefits for those type of cars. But if we just got a little family car and we only drive it at 30 miles an hour, well, we could stick a spoiler on it, and besides looking really cool, and that's debatable, most home users just don't need one. So unless you know your workload relies heavily on sync writes, you don't really need a slog. Okay, next, L2 arc, or what that stands for is Level 2 Adaptive Replacement Cache. And this acts as a secondary cache for ZFS, which primarily uses the RAM for caching recently accessed files. So when data is frequently read, ZFS tries to keep a copy of the most recent data in either its RAM, or if you have an L2 arc, when the RAM's maxed out, it can keep it there as well. So what does this do? Well, it speeds up the reads for data we constantly access, but it only does that if our RAM becomes full. If it doesn't, then this won't actually do anything at all. So in my opinion, if you've got a choice between an L2 arc and adding more RAM to your server, add more RAM to your server. ZFS loves RAM, it's super fast, and also more RAM in your server, it benefits the server all round. Now, one thing I think as well that a lot of people sometimes forget with an L2 arc device is it must be significantly faster than the actual main pool. Okay, so I think it's time for another analogy. Now, I really do love my analogies. Now, if you like coffee like me, and I've got mine here, imagine you go to work and there's a Starbucks across the street from your office. You go in there and you pick up a cup of coffee and you put it onto your desk. Now, the fastest way to get your caffeine hit is obviously to reach across to your desk, grab the coffee and to take a sip. But what happens when you run out of coffee? Well, you're going to have to walk all the way back to Starbucks and get another cup. So imagine the Starbucks is like the pool, and the cup of coffee on your desk is like the RAM or just a regular arc cache. Now, an L2 arc is a bit like you put a coffee machine down the hall a bit in the break room, And so you don't have to go all the way to Starbucks to get a coffee. You can more quickly get one by going to the break room. But if you put that same coffee machine up on, say, the 3rd or 4th floor, then you might have to go all the way up the stairs. It's going to be really tiring, and it'll take you longer than it would do just to pop out the door, pop across the street to Starbucks and grab a coffee. So my roundabout way with this crazy, silly story is basically what I'm trying to say is you always have to make sure with your L2 ARC device that it is actually faster than the actual pool you're pulling the data from. If it isn't, then you're really wasting your time having an L2 ARC, because it would be as fast or faster just to pull the data straight from the pool anyway. Okay, so let's move on to my least favorite auxiliary vdevs now. I'm going to talk about the special meta vdev. Now, this auxiliary vdev can store metadata like file structure and small files on a fast device, basically to improve access time. So what does this drive actually do? Well, it speeds up operations that involve lots of metadata lookups like directories with thousands and thousands of files. Now, there is a big downside. The downside is if this vdev is lost, like you don't have it mirrored, you only had one, you would actually lose the whole pool. So imagine that you had, say, 10, 20 terabyte drives in your Zpool, and you just had one 1 terabyte NVMe that you used as a special metadata vdev, and that one NVMe fails, well, you're going to lose the data on the whole of the pool. So unless you've really got a special reason to use a special vdev, then I would advise not to. And personally, if I was going to use a special vdev, I would probably have it triple mirrored. You really don't want that to fail because you would lose all of the data on the pool. Okay, I think it's time for another analogy. So imagine a pool without a special metadata vdev. It's basically like a delivery driver who uses a map. He gets around, he looks up the address, looks on the map, gets his paper map out, has a look, and gets to the destination. So having a special metadata vdev is a bit like he's got a GPS. So it's great, he can easily get around much quicker than using the map. But as soon as that GPS fails and he doesn't have that anymore, well, he can't actually do any deliveries at all. He knows the addresses, but he's got no maps and he can't see where anything is. So in my opinion, for us home labbers, we probably don't really have the use case that we'd need to have a special metadata vdev. So I think it's probably, in my opinion, best avoided. And the same I'd say with the deduplication vdevs as well. So how does deduplication work in ZFS? Well, basically we don't actually need to have a dedicated deduplication vdev in order to use deduplication. It will normally just use RAM, but it does use huge amounts of RAM. I think it's about 5 gigs per terabyte of deduplicated data that we need to have for deduplication to work properly. And so what the deduplication vdev does is we can add an additional drive to actually store the deduplication tables on that drive when we don't have enough RAM. But for most of us, we probably don't have loads of duplicated data. Now, if we had millions of, say, Windows 10 install ISOs, yes, we'd probably save a lot of space. But for people who use media servers and that kind of thing, I doubt you're going to have hundreds of copies of the same movie and that kind of thing. Now, an analogy for deduplication. Imagine that I hire someone to stay at home and I say, when I go to the shop, I'm going to call you, look in my cupboards and check I don't buy the same groceries. So I give them a call and I say, hey, pasta, do I have pasta? And they say, no, you got no pasta. And I think, well, yeah, that's because I ate it all last week and I wouldn't be going shopping if my cupboard was full of food. So what I'm trying to say here with my analogy is it's costing me more money to pay that person to be at home looking in my cupboards, and my shopping trip's taking me twice as long because I'm having to call them and say, is that food in the cupboard, yes or no? And then they have to tell me. So basically deduplication as well, if that VDEV actually failed, I would lose access to the data on that pool, just the same as I was talking about with these special VDEVs earlier. So I think for most people, you probably don't need to use a dedupe VDEV. That's just my opinion. Now, the last auxiliary VDEVs I'm going to speak about, they're not fully supported in Unraid yet, but they are coming soon. They're spares. And they are exactly what they sound like. Basically a spare drive you can add to a pool. So should one of the drives fails, it will automatically use that spare drive, pop it into the pool, resilver the data, and you don't actually have to swap out the drive yourself. So really, really useful in my opinion. Right, okay, so anyway, that's enough about the subpools. Let's move on and have a look at some other things. Okay, well, that took me a bit longer to actually talk about the auxiliary vdevs than I actually thought it would. So now here I'm on a different server. This is a fresh install of Unraid here because I wanted to show you with Unraid 7 what a new install would look like. So with Unraid 7, by default, the slots for the array devices are automatically set to none, and there are no pool devices. So if I wanted to add an array, well, I would choose the amount of slots here. Now the minimum is 3, and the maximum here we can have up to actually 30. So that would be 2 parity drives and up to 28 data drives. Like I said, I do love the Unraid Array. It is so versatile. One of my favorite things about the whole OS, to be quite honest. Now, I'm going to just say I'm going to use 3 drives here. No, in fact, I'm going to use 4 because 2 slots will always be taken by parity. So I'm going to put 1 parity drive in here and 2 data drives. Now, I've still got 2 drives left here, so I could actually add them to the array, or I could add them into a separate pool. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these into a separate pool. I'm going to have 2 different slots, add those drives in here, and use my favorite file system for pools. I'm going to choose these to be ZFS, and I'm going to mirror the 2 drives and put on compression. Okay, so when you've got your storage set up how you want, all we'd need to do then is just to click Start. And what this will do is it will start up the array and it will format all of these drives and start building parity. Now, as we can see here, all of the drives, they're currently not formatted. So I actually have to come here and choose to do that and format all of the unmountable disks. So I'm going to do that and click Format. Okay, so we just need to wait for these drives to format, and then after that, the parity sync to be completed. Okay, so everything's done now. So we can see here a fresh server on Unraid 7 is all set up. So slightly different how we set up a server from scratch on Unraid 7. The changes being just how we actually select the drives and pools. Okay, so I'm going to pop across now to another server. This one here that's also running Unraid 7. And let's check out on this server all of the cool new features that we can find in Unraid 7. Okay, so now in Unraid 7.0, let's get a little bit of insight based off numbers. So if you can remember earlier, we had a look in Unraid 6.12, what kernel version we had, what Docker version, libvirt, and QEMU. So let's do the same here. Okay, so kernel version. I think we've probably mentioned this multiple times today, but anyway, let's mention it one more time. So Linux kernel version in 7.0 is 6.6.68. And let's have a look at Docker. And the Docker version we can see here is 27.0.3. Now let's have a look at the hypervisor. Let's click on the VM manager here. So here we can see the libvirt version is 10.7.0 and QEMU we're running 9.1.0. Okay, so that's the boring numbers out of the way. Now let's go across and have a look at the dashboard. Okay, so here we are on the dashboard in Unraid 7. But I've also got another server up that's running Unraid 6.12, so we can just compare the dashboards on each. Now, this is obviously 6.12, and if we look at this tile here, where it gives the name of the server, the model, the license type, and the uptime, well, if we go across to Unraid 7, we can see this tile's been greatly improved. I really like the fact that it's got a clock, and clicking onto the clock brings us through to the date and time settings if we need to make any changes. Now, the next thing that is greatly improved, in my opinion, on the dashboard is this system tab here, which shows our RAM usage, flash drive usage, log usage and Docker image here. Now, if we compare it to the earlier version of Unraid, we actually had 5 things that we could see here: RAM, ZFS, Flash, log, and Docker. But as we can see, it was in a basic bar graph here. Now, let's pop back to Unraid 7. And what we can see with the RAM here, now there's not much RAM being used on this server for me, but the RAM usage is actually split up into different colors, as well as being written down here what it consists of. So my system RAM's using 4 gigs, ZFS only 625 megs, Docker 633 megs, so I've got 120 gigs free. So this is a really nice presentable way to show everything really, really easily. It's much less confusing, I think, than the original, where it is just these bar graphs. Okay, so other things that are new. The Docker container part here, which shows the Docker containers on our server, where we can toggle it on from all of the containers to just the started ones. This has remained, well, exactly the same. Looking here, we can see nothing additional has actually been added. But let's look at the virtual machine one underneath here. Well, nothing's actually changed in Unraid 7 for that particular piece. But if I start up a virtual machine here, and we can see this one's running now, underneath here, we can see some stats here for the virtual machine usage. So we can see that the guest CPU is using 1.6% of what I've assigned, and the host CPU, well, it's only using 1.5% as well. And we also get some nice metrics here for memory, disk, and network. So that is a really cool thing I think that's been added. It's nice to be able to see that on the dashboard. And whilst we're just looking at this virtual machine usage, I think why not go over and look at the VMs tab here on 7, and we can see that same information is presented at the top above all of my VMs here. So 2 places to see it, on the dashboard or on the VM tab itself. So other than that, I don't think there's really much different on the dashboard than there was in Unraid 6, but definitely some really nice improvements that make it look a lot better. Okay, let's move on to the main tab now. Well, obviously, as what we pointed out before, we don't need to have an Unraid array anymore. And if I go across to my other server here, we can see here that we actually have to have an array. Hence, I've got one here. Now, I don't have a parity drive on this array, basically because this server is not on all the time, and all it does is actually back up my main server's array here. So that's why you don't see a parity disk. So going back across onto Unraid 7 onto the main tab here, one other thing that's slightly different that you may not notice is if we scroll right down to the bottom here, well, there is something different, very minor, that you won't really see. Now, obviously, because this Unraid 7 server doesn't have an array, now this would be present if it did have an array, there's no history button here. If I go on to a server with an array, this Unraid 6 one here, well, here's a history button here. And if I go onto my main server, we can see the parity check history displayed at the bottom. So obviously, no Unraid array, no parity check history. Okay, so now let's look at what's new in shares here. But before looking at what's new, I think it makes sense really, we go back to the Unraid 6 server here, and we can see here, I've got the array, I've got one cache pool here, and a second here. And for those of you guys who are really paying attention, yes, this second pool wasn't here a moment ago. I've just added it to demonstrate this next part. So if I go to the Shares tab on Unraid 6, and I click Add Share, well, let's make a share and call it Test. And we can choose the primary storage from any one of the pools in the server. So if I wanted the primary storage to be the regular cache here, I could choose that. And then for my secondary storage, I've only got the option of having the array. And the mover action, it can move it from the cache to the array. So the first place the files can be written can be on some fast storage on the SSD cache, and then mover later on, moving it across to the array. But there's no option here to actually have any other pool as my secondary storage. And that's the big change in Unraid 7. If we go back to Unraid 7 now, and here we add a share, and we call it Test, the same. And for my primary storage, again, I've got 3 pools here. So if I added it to, say, warp speed, all of my primary files will go here first. But for my secondary storage, I can choose any pool or the array. I can have it go anywhere I want. So if I want it to go to ZRust, I can add that as my secondary location. And mover action, just as before, we can have it move either way. The standard, where we write the files to the fast pool first and then later on move them to the slower pool. But also, we can do it the other way around. So you might think, well, if we're writing it to the primary storage, which is warp speed, why would you want mover to move it from ZRust to warp speed? Well, there's a very good reason for that, is if I have my primary storage and this might become full, what this share will do then is it will continue writing the data onto the secondary storage ZRust here. And then what mover will do, instead of moving everything from the primary to the secondary, if it ever sees anything on the secondary and there's enough free space on the primary, it will move it back. So setting mover to this direction basically makes your primary storage the preferred location for data when space allows. And that's another really good reason why to put a minimum free space amount in. So if I put 100 gigs here, for this share, if there's ever less than 100 gigs, it will start putting it on ZRust. But otherwise, everything will always stay on warp speed. Okay, so that's all that's new with shares, but something I think that is really, really useful. Okay, for the next new feature in Unraid 7 that wasn't in 6, I'm going to go across to my main server, I think. And here at the top, you can see there's a tab called Favorites. If I click onto that, you can see here I've got Docker, Fix Common Problems, Samba, System Devices, System Drivers, Tailscale, USB Settings, Update OS, and VM Manager. So, how do these all get here? Well, let's go back to this server here, and if we go to either the Settings tab here, and we hover over any of these, if we click the little heart button here, it adds it to Favorites. And we can do exactly the same from the Tools menu here as well. We can add things into a Favorites, which I find really useful, because sometimes, to be honest, I tend to forget if an item is in Tools or Settings, because they're both quite similar. So once we actually add things into our Favorites here, we can just put the things here that we use a lot, and we don't really have to remember where they are. And if you don't want it anymore, well, you just click onto the little trash can here and remove them off, and your Favorites bar will disappear. Okay, now let's move on to settings here, because we have got a few new settings in Unraid 7. The first thing here that's new, we've got this power mode, which basically allows us to run our server in different ways. We can run it with best performance, balanced if that's available, or best power efficiency. Now, you might wonder why this is grayed out. Basically because my CPU doesn't have that option, but some CPUs will, and the ones that do, obviously, well, they're not going to be grayed out. So I've got the choice of best power efficiency or best performance. Now, this server I have running as best performance because this is my most powerful server for running VMs. But my main server here, you'll notice the power mode on this one is running as best power efficiency because this one's on 24/7. Okay, so another new feature under the network services here is this outgoing proxy manager. So simply put, an outgoing proxy is a bit like a middleman that sits between your Unraid server and the internet. And what it does is it routes certain types of network traffic through another server. Now, this can be useful in workplaces or places where you need to route all of the internet traffic through a specific system for things like security and monitoring. So in Unraid, this will be used by the web interface and some processes, but it won't be used by Docker containers and VMs. So that's something to keep in mind. But basically, the key point, I think, is if your server's already up and running smoothly, and you're thinking, what even is an outgoing proxy? Well, don't bother about it because you probably just don't need it. If you're going to use this feature, you probably already know that you need it. It can be used in some work environments or just for users who want to control their network traffic flow more carefully. Okay, so I think everything else in the settings is just the same. Now, plugins, again, nothing new on the plugins tab. But if we come across to Docker, well, there is a whole load of new things here. Now, I have spoken in detail about the Tailscale integration into Unraid Docker containers. So I'm not really going to go into it that much in this video. So if you want to know all about Tailscale and Unraid, then I really suggest you watch the Uncast video where we really deep dive into that, looking at all of it in detail. But for those of you who haven't seen it, we'll quickly talk about it. What we can do is we can take a container. So let's take this Firefox container here. And if I go to Edit and scrolling down here, you can see this button here we've got called Use Tailscale. If I toggle that on, what this allows me to do is install Tailscale directly into this Docker container. So what I will do is I'll call it Firefox and then scroll down. I'm not going to set anything else at all here. I'm just going to click on to apply. And now at the bottom, you'll notice on Docker pages, we've got a little button here that says View Container Log. Now, this is just quite useful for nothing to do with Tailscale. Just generally, I find it quite useful to be able to view the log straight away after installing a container. But with setting up Tailscale for the first time, we do actually have to click this button, or well, we have to view the log anyway. So we can see here that the server's installed Tailscale into this container. And so all I need to do now is authenticate this by signing into my Tailscale account, which will then add this container straight into my tailnet. So why is that useful? Well, it means we can access the containers from anywhere we like, but also we can actually share them with other people. You just pop their email address in and click on to share. And then that means anyone that I want to, I can have them share this Firefox container totally privately. It's not exposed on the internet. So a really useful feature in Unraid 7. And now if we look back at the installed container here, we can see this little icon that tells us that Tailscale is installed inside of this container. And now clicking on the container here, you can see we've got an additional web GUI button here, which uses the Tailscale address. So if I click onto that, allowing us in this case to log into Firefox through our Tailscale address. So definitely a very useful feature. Okay, so moving on to the VMs tab now. Now, there's a lot of changes here. We've already seen at the top here where we can see various metrics about the running VMs. And if I was to start up another one, we can see metrics for each that are running. Now, one very nice feature as well is we can actually now create snapshots of our VMs. So here, if I click Create Snapshot, I can actually create a snapshot of this running VM. And when I have this little button checked here, Memory Dump, it will even make a snapshot dumping the whole RAM of this VM as well into the snapshot. So what that means is when I start back up the VM, it will be in the exact same position as it is now. So if I had an Excel spreadsheet open, for instance, that same spreadsheet would be open. If I was halfway through watching a video, it would continue from that point in time where the snapshot was taken that I was watching the video. So here we can see we've got a snapshot name and we can give it a description. So the description, I'm just going to call it Uncast. So you can see here that the native file system that I'm using is ZFS. So if I check this, it would use ZFS to make the snapshot. If it's unchecked, it will use QEMU to make the snapshot. Now I'm going to use QEMU myself here. Now for this VM, I'm not going to do a memory dump, and I'll explain why in a moment. So I'm going to click on Proceed and take the snapshot. And now if we look at this VM, we can see this VM has got one snapshot. And if we look at the others here, we can see it says they all have none. Well, in fact, this NixOS one, it looks like I've made a snapshot before. Now, I did say I wasn't going to actually take a snapshot of this VM and dump the memory at the same time. Now, I'm going to show you why. So if we look at this VM here, I've got an RTX 3080 pass through to it. So if I try and take a snapshot now, let's call this Uncast 2 as the description, and I leave memory dump enabled and click Proceed, I'm going to get an error. You can see here the pass-through devices are mentioned here saying that VFIO migration is not supported in the kernel. Now, basically this is because I'm trying to take a snapshot of the RAM in the VM, and pass-through hardware does complicate matters. So if you get that error, just keep that in mind. You won't get that error if you take a snapshot of a VM with no hardware passed through. Okay, so let's create a brand new VM, and we'll take a snapshot of that in a moment, because it will give me a good opportunity to show you some of the cool new features in Unraid 7 regarding VMs. So obviously, I'm going to click on to add VM here, and I'm going to choose a template. I'm going to install a Linux VM, so I'm going to choose Linux. So I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it Pop OS. So just as we used to, we can put in a description here. So let's call it test1 VM. But underneath here, we can see there's something different. Now, I'm going to go back across, I think, to Unraid 6 quickly, so we can see the VM template there. So here's the exact same template on Unraid 6. So we can see here, we've only got description, then we come to CPU mode, and then our logical CPU. So let's go back to 7, and here we have a web UI that we can actually start from. And clicking here on the little question mark here, it expands information that we can see about the various sections. And here under web UI, we can see here that we can actually change the web UI for which we want when we click on it for the VM to go to. And a great example of this, if we look on my other VM here, where I run Home Assistant, clicking onto here and then going Open Web UI, here I've specified the web UI of the Home Assistant VM. Then clicking here, it goes straight into Home Assistant. But also one thing to notice is we can still also just go into the normal VNC console as well. So in my opinion, a really useful feature for VMs that may be running various services, because we can just click on the Open Web UI and go straight in. So basically any OS that's managed by a web UI, well, we can actually specify it here, and it makes it super easy for us to be able to access and manage it. Okay, so next we can choose the host CPU or an emulated QEMU CPU. But if we see here, there's this extra part here where it says migratable, and this can be turned on and off. Okay, so just what is this migratable? Well, in QEMU, migratable is actually by default turned on. And what it's used for is for live migration. It lets you move a virtual machine between two different physical servers without actually shutting them down. Now, here's one thing though, is Unraid doesn't actually support live migration, so we don't need this feature. And actually leaving it on can limit the CPU's performance in VMs because it hides some advanced features that keeps things compatible across different hardware. So since we don't need it, my advice is to actually turn it off, and you're going to get better performance, because your VM then can take advantage of the full power and all of the features of your CPU. Okay, so obviously I'm going to leave this turned off. Now I'm going to choose some logical virtual CPUs here. I think that's going to be enough. Now, personally, I never have the first CPU ever pinned with my VMs because Unraid tends to want to use that one. So I think it's best actually to leave that unpinned. Okay, so memory, I think 8 gigs is going to be enough. And machine type here, we can choose QEMU or i440FX. And we can see we can go up to 9.1 here. That's because it's related to what we saw earlier when we looked at the QEMU version here. So whatever the QEMU version is, you're always going to have that version that we choose in our VMs here. So I'm going to use Q35 here. Now, everything else here is the same as it was in Unraid 6. But there's one thing I'm going to show you in a moment is connecting an install ISO to the VM. Now, of course, we can do it as we used to by clicking here, and then that brings up the ISO share on the server, and we can choose our ISOs this way. And now I'm actually going to choose the wrong ISO. I'm going to choose Bazzite here, and I'm not actually going to be installing Bazzite because this is Pop OS. And I'm going to come back and show you how we can easily change the ISO in a moment. So let's scroll down now and add a virtual disk. So let's make this 50 gigs. And I'm going to select a QCOW2 disk because I prefer QCOW2 personally. Now there's one new thing here. We can see here, discard, we can basically turn the trim on and off on the VM if the vdisk is on an SSD. Now, we didn't have this in Unraid 6, as you can see here. So by default, this is actually on. Now, just as in Unraid 6, we can specify a serial number for the vdisk if we want to, but let's move down to the next new feature here, is if we pass through a GPU, so here, say I was going to pass through my RTX 3080, and obviously passing through a GPU, you should always pass through the sound counterpart. But what we can do now in Unraid 7 is we can, when we're passing through a GPU, we can enable multifunction here. And what this does is it basically makes the GPU appear like a real piece of hardware. Because obviously with a GPU, the VGA part and the sound part are on the same piece of silicon that's plugged into your PCI slot. So if we don't enable multifunction, it can make the GPU look like it's two separate pieces of hardware. So by enabling multifunction, this gives us better performance in the VM when we're passing through a GPU. Now, the only way to do that in Unraid 6 was to actually edit the XML, which could be rather tricky. So now we've got the option here to be able to turn this on and off from inside of the GUI. So I think that's a really, really nice improvement. But I'm not actually going to be using a pass-through GPU for this VM. I'm going to be using a virtual GPU. And let's get rid of the sound as well. So here, nothing really that's been added. So let's scroll down to the next new feature. Now in Unraid 6, this would have been the end of the actual template. But can you see here, it says advanced tuning options. Well, let's go to Unraid 6, and at the bottom, we don't see that at all. So if I scroll down even further, we can see there's some more advanced features that for most users you probably won't need, but they can be really, really cool. Now, something I really like here is this QEMU command line part, where we can put in basically special XML that allows us to do fancy things with our VM. Now, I'm going to show you one thing on another VM where I use this, and that's this VM here, which is called Raiser Laptop. Now, this VM actually, I never actually created it as a VM specifically. This actually used to be my Raiser Laptop before I was drinking a cup of tea and I managed to drop it on the laptop and destroy the machine. It was a really sad day for me. But so what I did is I took out the NVMe and I popped it into the Unraid server and I copied the NVMe. That's why we can see here, it's about 1 terabyte. Now I had a lot of software on there and various kind of licensed software that I wanted to make sure would run properly. So what I did is if we look at the template of this one and I scroll down, you can see here I've put in some extra QEMU command line. So what I've done is I've specified various things to make this look like it was my Raiser laptop. And so this is actually the VM running. Now the Raiser laptop, it had a 3080 inside of it. So that was quite lucky because it was the same GPU I had inside of my server. So we can see that's here. But if I open up the settings here and look at About System, we can see here that it thinks it's a Razer Blade 15 Advanced model mid-2021. Now, also, I made sure that the device ID and product ID matched for this Windows VM so that all of my software would work. Now, something else that is pretty cool is if we check what the UUID of this actual VM is, that's the UUID here. Now, I specified this inside the QEMU command line as well. And putting it here overrides what's in the XML when the VM is first created. Now, I'm going to show you something pretty cool, which I didn't show you earlier, is we've also in Unraid 7 got this little button here where we can show inline XML. So what this can do is show us the XML alongside the graphical GUI display of the VM. So I think that's really cool that we can see both together. So here you can see the UUID of this actual VM that the hypervisor specified. Well, I've overridden it with what the UUID was really on my Razer laptop at the time. So what this did is allow me to basically keep running my laptop and Windows wasn't any the wiser. Now, using this in combination with other techniques can be a good way of making an OS think that it's not running actually as a VM. Now, I might do a detailed video in to do with that at some time. So if you want me to, if enough people ask, then we might make a video on that. Okay, so that's what the QEMU command line part of the VM template's for here. Now also here, we can change the clock offset and the timer source. And a very interesting thing at the bottom here is something called vdev. Now this is another way of passing through things like keyboard and mice. Now I don't actually have anything plugged into my server at the moment, but what it does is it allows you to pass it through in a different way, basically, than when you plug in a USB keyboard or mouse into your system and have it pass through that way. So vdev can have two advantages. It's got slightly better performance and lower latency than even if you pass through your USB keyboard and mouse as a USB device here. It also allows us to pass through USB keyboard and mice to really old systems, things like Windows 95 that don't even have USB drivers, and still be able to pass through keyboards and mice to systems like that. Okay, so that is all of the new things in VMs in Unraid 7. So I better not click on create because remember I've got the Bazzite ISO here. So I'm going to untick start VM after creation and I'm going to click on to create. Okay, so here's the VM. Now if we move across here, we can see this column here where it says VDisks and VCDs. So VDisk, well, we all know what that is, virtual disk. And here VCDs is basically ISO images, virtual CDs and DVDs. Now remember I had the Bazzite image in, and if I click here, we can actually see that. Now notice this little eject button, so I could remove it this way. So now we can see no CD is inserted. So I could either click here or here now, and now we can select an ISO image. But the good thing is we can select it from anywhere on the server. Now, when we're doing it in the template, it only allows us to select from the ISO share. So say you've just downloaded an ISO and it's in your download share on the server. Well, this would be the way you want to add it. Because here, you see, I can browse through all of my shares here and add an ISO image from anywhere I want. So anyway, I'm installing Pop! OS. So let's install this one here. And I'm going to click on to insert. And so now you see that we've actually swapped over the image to the correct one. So now I can actually start up the VM and do the install. Oh, okay, so it's all installed. Let's log in. Okay, so I'm going to open up YouTube here. Oh, God, no, I'm not a robot. Right, let's type youtube.com. rather than a cert. And let's put on a cat video. Okay, so as this is a short, it should just keep replaying and replaying. So I'm going to minimize this now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and take a snapshot now. But I'm actually going to have another error. Now, I wanted to show you this so you can understand why the errors happen and not worry about it if you have the error. So I'm going to click on to create snapshot. And if you remember, I said that we can dump the memory when there's no hardware being passed through. So I'm just going to call this first install, and I'm going to choose memory dump, and I'm not going to check this. I want to use a QEMU snapshot, and I'm going to click proceed. So 3, 2, 1, error. So what we can see here is it cannot migrate the domain. So remember when I was talking about the migratable setting in the VM template? I said Unraid doesn't actually use this feature to migrate a VM from one server to another. But if we want to make snapshots and dump the memory, we do kind of need this. So it's a choice that you have to make. Do you want slightly better performance and have migratable turned off? Or do you want to be able to take snapshots of the VM and dump the memory at the same time? Okay, so let's turn off this VM and edit it, and we'll change the CPU to be migratable and start it back up and go straight back to YouTube and play our cat video. Let's minimize this now. And now let's try and take our snapshot. So third time lucky, hey? So I'm going to click on to create snapshot. Again, I'm going to call it first install. I'm going to dump the memory and I'm going to click proceed. Okay, so finally we've actually got our snapshot along with the memory being dumped. Okay, so let's go back and the video is still playing. So let's close this. Okay, so that's all closed and let's shut this down. Okay, so how do we actually restore a snapshot? Well, what we do is we go to our VM and we click onto it. Now here we can see snapshots at the bottom. Here's the description I gave it, saying first install, the date and time the snapshot was made, and the type of snapshot that it was. And here it tells us the parent, which is the base install, when I actually installed the VM. And we can see here that the vdisk is no longer the vdisk one like we had earlier. So let's start back up the VM. And let's go in here and just delete a whole bunch of files. So I'm going to delete these folders here, move them to trash, and let's empty the trash. And we'll imagine those folders were all full. So let's shut down the VM. So back at the VM, let's go ahead and restore the snapshot. So let's click onto the VM here. And at the bottom here, we can see snapshots. And here, if we click on these little 2 lines here, I can click revert snapshot and go back to this snapshot. So I'm going to click onto that now. And what we can see here is it's going to remove this vdisk here, which is what we're pointing to at the moment. So I'm going to click on to proceed and do that. And so now do you see that we've gone back to vdisk1.qcal2. So that was the base image of what the snapshot was actually using. So it's kind of slightly different to what you might be used to with ZFS snapshots, where you actually roll back to the snapshot. When you roll back with a QEMU snapshot, you kind of roll back to the moment just before you took the snapshot. So we can see the VMs running here now. So let's open up the VNC window. And hey, the cat video is playing. Absolutely awesome. So because we actually dumped the memory as well, the VM is just continuing from that moment in time. And if we close this now, and we go and look at our files and folders, well, they're all back as well. So it's very easy to be able to take snapshots and restore VMs. But just remember the caveats when it comes to snapshots and the criteria you need if you want to make a snapshot and dump the memory at the same time. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything in the new Unraid. I can't think of anything else to tell you, but I'm pretty sure after publishing this video, I'll think of something. But hey, I'm going to show you guys something before I go. I've just got a new hard drive this morning. This is actually the largest one I've ever had, 22 terabytes. And I'm going to be using this in an upcoming Uncast video that should be out very soon, where I'm going to build an extremely low power server. It's going to be sipping electricity in the same way as a politician sips the truth, sparingly, if at all. Anyway, everyone, this brings us to the end of this Uncast show. Now, remember, if you want to watch about Tailscale, then check out the Tailscale episode on the Uncast show. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next one.